The sun was setting over Earth, casting a fiery orange glow across the horizon. But the beauty of the evening was lost on Captain Alexander Blake. As he stood at the command center of the Earth Defense Force, looking out at the view of his home planet, the weight of impending war pressed down on him like an invisible force. The galaxy was changing, and not for the better. Far beyond the stars, beyond the edge of what humans had ever explored, a new presence was making its way toward them. A force so powerful, so ancient, that it could erase everything humanity had built in the blink of an eye. Blake had been briefed on the Vakari, a species that had never before interacted with Earth, and yet, here they were, making their intentions clear. Their message was simple: submit or be destroyed. The first warning came in the form of a single encrypted transmission, one that Blake watched over and over. It was a video, and though it was hard to make out, the faces of the alien emissaries were unlike anything Blake had seen before. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity, their skin dark and smooth like obsidian. Their leader, a towering figure, spoke in a language that sent a chill down Blake's spine, even though he couldn't understand a word. It was the feeling that stayed with him, the sense of something powerful, something ancient, reaching out from the unknown. The message was clear. Earth was nothing more than a speck in the grand scheme of the galaxy, and the Vakari were the gatekeepers of the stars. Humanity was insignificant, and their time had come. Blake turned away from the screen, his hands clenched into fists. His mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening. Was this some kind of mistake? Surely no alien species would be foolish enough to challenge Earth. Humanity had proven itself capable of taking on the toughest of foes, surviving wars, natural disasters, and even the collapse of entire governments. But this felt different. The Vakari weren't just any alien species. They were more advanced, more organized, and their presence stirred something deep inside Blake. Something he couldn't yet put into words. He knew that humanity had made enemies in the past, but this felt like the fight for their very existence. It wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a battle for identity. The tension in the air grew thicker as Blake's team assembled for a meeting. The room was filled with military leaders and experts, all trying to make sense of the alien threat. Blake took his seat at the head of the table, his face hard, his eyes focused. He knew the stakes were higher than ever before. This wasn't just about winning a battle. It was about protecting everything humanity had ever built. The Vakari were unlike any enemy they had faced, and yet, something told him they were not invincible. There was something about their arrogance, their certainty that humanity would bend to their will, that sparked a fire in Blake's chest. No one told humanity what to do, and Blake was determined to make sure the Vakari learned that lesson the hard way. But as the War Council began to discuss their options, Blake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the Vakari were already one step ahead. He could feel their presence even though they were still light years away. There was an eerie silence that settled over the room, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Blake's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of an alarm blaring through the building, cutting through the tension like a knife. His heart skipped a beat. He knew what it meant. The Vakari had arrived. The entire room went into a frenzy as military personnel rushed to their stations, securing weapons, preparing for the worst. Blake stood up, his jaw clenched, his mind racing. He knew what needed to be done, but for the first time, doubt crept into his mind. Was humanity ready for this? Could they really face down an enemy like the Vakari? The air felt charged, electric, as the countdown began. Blake could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. The fate of Earth, the fate of humanity rested on his shoulders. As the countdown ticked down to 0, the ground beneath them rumbled, and the sky above the base darkened. Blake looked out the window, his breath catching in his throat. The Vakari fleet had arrived, their ships massive, their presence overwhelming. The size and scope of their invasion was unlike anything humanity had ever faced. Blake's heart pounded in his chest, but there was no time for fear. He had trained for this moment his entire life. He was ready. But as the Vakari ships moved into position, something strange happened. There was a shift in the atmosphere, an odd, inexplicable calm that spread across the room. The tension didn't dissipate, but it changed, taking on a different form. Blake could feel it in the pit of his stomach. The Vakari weren't just here to conquer Earth. They were here for something else, something more than power, more than control. They had come for humanity's soul, to challenge the very essence of who they were. The question burned in Blake's mind. Could humanity face this challenge? Could they prove themselves worthy of the stars? Or would they fall like so many civilizations before them? As the first volley of energy blasts from the Vakari ships erupted in the distance, Blake knew that this was only the beginning. The war had truly begun, and the future of humanity hung in the balance. The ground trembled as the first Vakari blasts struck Earth's defenses. Captain Alexander Blake stood at the command center, eyes locked on the screens, heart pounding in his chest. The city below was in chaos, a storm of fire and destruction rising up into the darkened sky. The war had begun, and there was no going back. Blake's mind raced, his instincts kicking in. But even with everything he had trained for, the sight before him felt unreal. The Vakari ships, massive and intimidating, loomed in the sky like dark gods, their weapons tearing through the night. Each explosion felt like a personal blow, a challenge to everything humanity had built. Blake's hand tightened around the edge of the console, his knuckles white. He could feel the eyes of his fellow soldiers on him, waiting for him to make a decision. They had trained for years, but nothing could have prepared them for this. The Vakari were here to conquer, to destroy, and they weren't just attacking Earth. They were attacking everything that humanity stood for. Blake had never been one to shy away from a fight, but this was different. This was not just about saving Earth. This was about proving that humanity belonged in the stars. "We need to strike back, Captain," said Lieutenant Mara Williams, her voice firm, but tinged with the same fear that Blake could feel in his own chest. "We can't wait for them to hit us again." Blake turned to face her, his gaze steady. She was right, of course. Time was running out. Every second they wasted was another chance for the Vakari to tighten their grip on Earth. The fleet above them was just the beginning. The real attack was coming. Blake could feel it, a growing sense of dread building in his gut. "Prepare the strike force," Blake said, his voice calm but unwavering. "We're going to hit them hard. Let's show them what humanity is made of." Mara nodded, already moving to relay the orders. The soldiers in the room were already moving with a sense of purpose, but the weight of the moment hung heavy on their shoulders. The fear in the air was palpable, but there was something else too. A fire, a determination to fight, to survive. Blake could feel it in his bones. Humanity would not be wiped out without a fight. The first wave of soldiers, Blake included, boarded the fighter ships, the hum of engines roaring to life. As the ships ascended into the sky, Blake looked down at Earth below. The blue of the oceans and the green of the continents looked so fragile, so small under the shadow of the Vakari fleet. It was a reminder of how precious their home was, how far they had come, and how much they stood to lose. The mission ahead was clear. Strike the Vakari at their command center, disrupt their operations, and buy Earth some time. But Blake knew that time was running out. Every moment they hesitated could mean their extinction. The fighters sliced through the sky, the roar of their engines echoing through the atmosphere. Blake's hands gripped the controls tightly as they approached the Vakari fleet. The alien ships were unlike anything Blake had ever seen, smooth and black like they were made from the shadows themselves. They moved with precision, almost as if they knew what humanity was going to do before they did it. It was as though the Vakari had been preparing for this battle for centuries, and Blake couldn't shake the feeling that they had underestimated their enemies. The first shots were fired as the fleet came into range. Blake's ship shook violently as the Vakari returned fire, but he didn't flinch. He'd trained for this. They all had. The fighters around him swooped in, dodging and weaving through a hail of energy blasts, each one barely missing their mark. Blake's heart raced, adrenaline flooding his system, but his focus never wavered. He locked onto his target, a Vakari warship near the center of the fleet. With a deep breath, he fired. The explosion was blinding. For a moment, everything was silent, as if the universe had taken a breath. Blake watched in awe as the warship disintegrated, its fragments scattering through the stars. It was a victory, but it was hollow. The Vakari weren't going to give up that easily. He could feel it in the air, the way the tension grew with each passing moment. "We've got more incoming." Mara's voice crackled through the comms, her words sharp and urgent. Blake looked up just in time to see a second wave of Vakari fighters breaking through. The fleet's defenses. There was no time to celebrate. The battle had just begun, and they were outnumbered. Blake's ship was hit again, the shockwave rattling his bones. He barely held onto the controls as his ship spiraled through the air. He fought to regain control, his mind working 1,000 miles a minute. There was no time for hesitation. He fired again, taking down 2 more Vakari fighters in quick succession. But the enemy was relentless. With every shot, the odds seemed to stack higher against them. It was clear that the Vakari were more than just an enemy. They were a force of nature, unstoppable and unyielding. Blake's pulse quickened as he watched his fellow soldiers fall, their ships engulfed in flames as they collided with the Vakari forces. The war was taking a toll. Humanity was losing, and it was hard to deny the truth. But Blake couldn't give up, not yet. Not when everything he had ever fought for was on the line. Then, in the midst of the chaos, something unexpected happened. A Vakari ship broke away from the main fleet, heading straight toward Earth. Blake's instincts kicked in and he locked onto the ship, preparing to take it down. But before he could fire, something strange occurred. The Vakari ship seemed to change course, diverting at the last second. It was almost as if the ship was being controlled by something or someone else. Blake's eyes narrowed. Something was happening. The Vakari were not just invaders. They were more than he had anticipated. He could feel it in the air. A growing sense of dread that had nothing to do with the battle itself. The Vakari weren't just here to conquer. They were here for something much deeper, much more dangerous. And Blake had a sinking feeling that they hadn't seen the worst of it yet. As the battle raged on, Blake's thoughts drifted back to the Vakari's first message. Submit or be destroyed. But he wasn't ready to submit, not yet. As long as there was breath in his lungs, humanity would fight. The war had only just begun, and the true test of their will had yet to come. The darkness of space stretched out in every direction. Endless and cold, but for Captain Alexander Blake, it felt more like a cage than an expanse. The Vakari fleet loomed in the distance, still hovering like shadows on the edge of the human empire. The battle had raged for days, and though humanity had made its mark, the Vakari had proven themselves to be far more formidable than anyone had anticipated. The initial optimism that came with the first strike had faded, replaced by the grim reality that Earth's forces were being pushed to the brink. Blake felt the weight of his responsibility pressing on his chest, heavier with each passing moment. Captain, we're losing ground. Lieutenant Mara Williams' voice crackled over the comms. The Vakari are regrouping. We need to take out their command center or we won't last much longer. Blake's grip tightened on the control stick, his mind racing. He had been prepared for a long war, but this felt like something more. The Vakari weren't just invaders. They were an ancient, relentless force, and their ability to adapt was terrifying. Every tactic humanity threw at them seemed to be countered before it could even take root. But Blake wasn't one to back down. He couldn't afford to lose hope now, not with the entire future of the human race hanging in the balance. Prepare for a direct strike on their flagship, Blake ordered, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. We're going in. His team was ready. The soldiers that followed him had seen the horrors of war, but there was something different about this fight. This wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a battle for humanity's place in the universe. As Blake's fighter ship soared into the heart of the Vakari fleet, he couldn't help but feel a sense of dread settle in his stomach. There was something deeply unsettling about the way the Vakari ships moved, as if they were alive, as if they could think and anticipate every move. It was like fighting against a shadow, a force that could see them before they even acted. The first volley of fire came at them, a blast of energy that lit up the black void of space. Blake's ship shook violently, but he kept his focus, weaving through the onslaught with skill and precision. His heart raced, but his mind stayed sharp. He couldn't afford to falter, not now. As they closed in on the Vakari flagship, Blake's thoughts wandered to the mystery that had been gnawing at him since the first contact with the alien race. What was it about the Vakari that made them so relentless? Why did they want Earth? And why were they so determined to wipe humanity out? The Vakari didn't just want victory. They wanted humanity to submit, to bend to their will, to be nothing more than a piece of their galactic puzzle. But Blake wasn't willing to let that happen. Not without a fight. Not without making sure the galaxy knew humanity's name. The flagship loomed ahead, a massive structure that seemed to absorb the light around it, as if it were an entity unto itself. Blake's ship rocked again as they entered the final stretch of their approach. His pulse quickened as the target lock appeared on his display. He had only one shot at this, one chance to strike at the heart of the Vakari's command structure. One mistake and it would be over. But just as he was about to fire, something unexpected happened. A new wave of Vakari ships emerged from the shadows, their sleek forms cutting through the dark like phantoms. Blake's instincts screamed at him to turn back, to retreat and regroup, but it was too late. The Vakari were closing in on all sides, cutting off their escape route. Blake's fighter was trapped in the middle of the fleet, surrounded by enemy ships that were closing in with terrifying speed. "Captain, we need to pull back." Mara's voice echoed in his earpiece, but Blake knew they didn't have the time. They were too far in and the mission was too important. The odds were stacked against them, but they had to keep pushing forward. Blake's grip tightened on the controls, his mind focused entirely on the task ahead. He knew the danger. He knew the risks. But there was no turning back now. The fate of humanity rested on their shoulders, and Blake wouldn't be the one to let them fall. As the enemy ships closed in, Blake locked onto the Vakari flagship once again, lining up his shot with deadly precision. He could feel the weight of the decision on his chest, the pressure mounting with every second that passed. This was it. There would be no second chances. He fired. The explosion was deafening. For a moment, the world went silent, and Blake's heart skipped a beat as he watched the flagship erupt in a burst of fiery destruction. It was a victory, but it came with a bitter aftertaste. They had struck a blow, but the Vakari were not defeated. They would come again, and next time they would be prepared. But just as the shockwaves of the explosion reached them, something happened that Blake didn't expect. The Vakari fleet didn't retreat. Instead, their ships shifted formation, coming together in a way that made Blake's blood run cold. They weren't retreating. They were adapting. They were evolving, and Blake realized with a chill that the Vakari were not just fighting for dominance. They were fighting to survive too, and that made them more dangerous than ever. Blake's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the Vakari fleet regroup, knowing that the battle was far from over. But there was a fire inside him now, a fire that had been lit with every loss, every moment of uncertainty. They might not win this fight, but Blake would be damned if they didn't give everything they had to the fight. Humanity had come too far to lose now. The war was only just beginning, and the true test of their will had yet to come. As Blake's fighter pulled back to join the rest of the human forces, he looked out at the battlefield. The stars above were no longer just a backdrop for the fight. They were a reminder of what humanity stood to lose. But Blake knew that no matter what happened, he would fight until the last breath for Earth, for humanity, and for the future of the galaxy itself. The sound of static echoed through the comms, a signal of the chaos that was unfolding. Blake's fighter shook violently as he pulled it back from the battlefield, the cockpit flashing with warnings and alarms. The battle had turned into a nightmare. Vakari ships were everywhere, each one like a shadow, moving in unison with terrifying precision. Blake's hands gripped the controls tighter, but the tension in his chest wouldn't ease. It wasn't just the battle that weighed on him now. It was the nagging feeling that the Vakari were hiding something bigger than anyone could have imagined. As Blake's fighter descended toward the Earth Defense Force base, he couldn't shake the thought that this war was becoming less about fighting for survival and more about uncovering a mystery that stretched beyond the stars. Once on the ground, Blake rushed to the command center. His boots echoed against the cold metal floor as he moved, his mind racing. The Vakari weren't like any enemy humanity had faced before. Their ships, their tactics, their methods, they all suggested something deeper, something ancient, like they had been waiting for humanity's rise only to crush it. Blake pushed the door open and entered, his eyes immediately finding Mara's. She was standing near the war table, her face pale, but her eyes were sharp with determination. "They're adapting," she said quietly, her voice strained but steady. "We've taken down ships, but they keep coming. And they're learning. They know exactly how we fight." Blake nodded grimly. He had seen it too. The Vakari weren't just reacting to human strategies. They were anticipating them, countering before humanity could even make its move. It was like they were one step ahead always. That feeling of being hunted, of being prey, gnawed at Blake's insides. He knew the Vakari weren't just here for Earth. They were here for something far more elusive. "We need to find out why," Blake muttered. "Why Earth? Why now?" Mara looked at him, her eyes flickering with the same unease he felt. What if they've known about us all along? What if this war was planned from the beginning? The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of a possibility neither of them wanted to consider. Blake turned toward the screen displaying the war plans. There was no time for doubt. The Vakari were relentless, but so were they. They couldn't afford to question their motives now. They had to act. The soldiers were already preparing for another assault, but Blake couldn't stop the growing sense of urgency deep within him. This wasn't just another battle. This was something more. As the plans were discussed around him, Blake's thoughts drifted back to the Valkyrie leader, the towering figure with the glowing eyes who had spoken during the first transmission. There was something in the way they had addressed humanity, something in the arrogance of their words that unsettled him. They hadn't just demanded submission. They had spoken as if they had been waiting for humanity to arrive, as if Earth's rise was part of some larger, inevitable fate. Blake's mind snapped back to the present as the sirens blared again. A new wave of Valkyrie ships was approaching. No more time for questions. They had to fight. He grabbed his helmet and headed for the hangar, the feeling of impending doom heavy in his chest. This time they were going for the heart of the Valkyrie forces, a direct strike at the enemy flagship. It was risky, but it was the only choice they had. The fighter jets roared to life as Blake and Mara climbed into their ships. As they ascended into the sky, Blake could feel the tension in the air, a charged atmosphere that seemed to vibrate with every passing moment. He glanced at Mara, who was silent, her face set in a determined mask. She knew this wasn't just another mission. This was the moment that could decide everything. As they entered the void of space, the Valkyrie fleet came into view, vast and foreboding, its dark ships blotting out the stars. Blake's heart pounded as they dove into the fray, weaving between the massive ships, their weapons lighting up the darkness. This time there was no hesitation. The humans had to hit the Valkyrie at their core. Blake's target was clear, the flagship at the center of the fleet, the heart of their power. But as they closed in, something unexpected happened. The Valkyrie ships shifted, moving together with a fluid, unnatural precision. They were no longer just enemies. They were a coordinated force responding with an eerie, synchronized grace that made Blake's blood run cold. Blake's ship jolted as an energy blast hit his wing, sending him into a spin. He struggled to regain control, his eyes focused on the flagship, but his mind was racing. What were the Valkyrie up to? Why had they changed their tactics so suddenly? Every instinct told him something was wrong, but there was no time to investigate. He had to push forward. As his fighter steadied, Blake locked onto his target once more and fired. The blast hit the flagship dead center, a massive explosion rocking the surrounding space. Blake watched, breath held as the Valkyrie ship erupted in a shower of fire and debris. It was a victory, but it didn't feel like one. The Valkyrie ships didn't retreat. Instead, they reformed, the fleet's movements now almost ritualistic, as though they were following a preordained path. Blake's mind raced. The Valkyrie were too organized, too precise. There was something else going on here, something they hadn't seen yet. As Blake maneuvered his ship to avoid another volley, Mara's voice crackled through the comms. "They're not just fighting to win, Blake, they're fighting for something. And I think they want us to understand that." Blake's heart sank as the words hit him. The Valkyrie were not just invaders, they were playing a game, one that humanity was struggling to understand. As the enemy fleet closed in again, Blake realized that this war was more than just a battle for Earth. It was a battle for something deeper, something that neither he nor humanity could have predicted. The Valkyrie were not the true threat. It was what they represented, what they were guarding, that Blake needed to understand. And with that thought, a new sense of determination flooded him. This war was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The world below trembled, the sound of distant explosions echoing through the atmosphere like thunder on a stormy night. Captain Alexander Blake stood at the edge of the command center, staring out at the chaos unfolding. The Valkyrie fleet had regrouped faster than anyone could have anticipated, their dark ships now spreading across the sky like a swarm of locusts. Blake's pulse was steady, but his mind was racing. Earth's forces had fought bravely, but there was no denying the truth. Humanity was losing. Every victory they claimed felt hollow, as if the Valkyrie were always a step ahead, always prepared for the next move. And now Earth was facing the full brunt of the invasion. It was clear that if something didn't change, the war would be lost. Blake turned away from the window, his jaw clenched. There was no time for doubt. His eyes met Mara's across the room. She had always been his rock, the one who kept him grounded in the darkest moments. Now her face was set in a hard, determined mask, but Blake could see the fear in her eyes. She knew what he was thinking. They both did, The battle was far from over, but the odds were becoming insurmountable. "The Vakari fleet is too strong," Mara said, her voice low, almost lost in the hum of the command center. "We need a decisive strike. If we don't take out their flagship now, it's all over." Blake nodded grimly, his fingers brushing over the edge of the table. The Vakari flagship had been the key to everything. It was more than just a command center. It was the heart of the invasion, the source of their power. Blake had been hoping that a strike to the flagship would cripple the Vakari forces, but with each failed attempt it became clear that it was more than just a ship. It was a symbol of the Vakari's unyielding will, a force that refused to break. "We're going in," Blake said, his voice steady. "We're taking down their flagship no matter what." The room fell silent as Blake's words sank in. The plan was risky, the stakes higher than ever. The Vakari ships had become more than just weapons. They had become a part of the very fabric of the war. Their movements were no longer just calculated. They were instinctual, as though the Vakari were driven by something deeper, something primal. And Blake couldn't help but wonder, what was it that the Vakari were truly fighting for? What lay at the heart of this war? The engines of the fighter ships roared to life as Blake and Mara climbed aboard their crafts. The air was thick with tension, every soldier on edge knowing that this could be their final mission. As the fighters ascended, Blake glanced over at Mara. She was focused, her eyes locked on the battle ahead, but he could see the weight of the situation in the tight set of her jaw. They had come too far to fail now. The Vakari fleet stretched out before them, an impenetrable wall of darkness. Blake's hands gripped the controls, his mind hyper-focused on the task at hand. He knew this was their last chance. If they couldn't take down the flagship now, humanity's resistance would crumble. But as they moved closer, something strange happened. The Vakari ships didn't attack. Instead, they parted, forming a path that led straight to the heart of the fleet, the flagship itself. Blake's heart skipped a beat as he followed the opening. This was not a trap. It couldn't be. But it felt wrong. The Vakari were too precise, too deliberate. It was as if they were inviting them in, allowing humanity a chance to strike. Blake's instincts screamed at him to pull back, to call off the attack, but it was too late. The path had been laid out for them. There was no turning back. As they closed in on the flagship, the size and scale of the ship became apparent. It was unlike anything Blake had ever seen, vast, imposing, and covered in intricate patterns that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. There was something almost organic about it, as though the ship itself was alive, breathing, waiting. Blake's mind raced as he locked onto the target. This was it. One shot, one moment to end it all. But even as he prepared to fire, a voice crackled through the comms. "Captain Blake," a voice echoed, its tone calm and steady. Blake froze, his finger hovering over the trigger. The voice was alien, but not in the way he expected. It wasn't hostile. It was curious. "You think you can win this war, but you fail to understand. The Vakari are not your enemies. We are protectors, guardians of something far greater than you can imagine. Your species has only begun to awaken." Blake's breath caught in his throat. The voice was coming from the flagship itself, and for the first time, Blake felt a chill of doubt seep into his mind. He had expected to hear threats, promises of annihilation, but not this. Not an offer to understand. But before he could respond, the voice continued, "You have been chosen, Blake, chosen to protect the future. The Vakari are not your conquerors. We are your teachers. You are more than you realize, and so is your planet. This war is not about power. It is about destiny." Blake's mind was spinning. His instincts told him to destroy the flagship, to end the fight once and for all, but the words lingered in his thoughts. Protectors, teachers. What was the Vakari leader trying to say? Was humanity truly part of something greater, or was this just another manipulation? Without warning, a flash of light erupted from the flagship, and Blake's fighter shook violently as the blast grazed his ship. It was a warning that no matter how far humanity had come, they were still too small, too fragile to understand the forces they were up against. But Blake couldn't afford to back down. Not now. Not after everything they had sacrificed. "Let's finish this," Blake muttered under his breath as he locked onto the flagship once again, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He fired. The explosion rocked the battlefield, and for a moment everything went silent. But it was only the beginning. As the dust settled, Blake realized that the Vakari were not backing down. They were merely evolving, adapting, and as the fleet reformed around them, Blake knew one thing for certain. Humanity's fight was far from over. The mystery of the Vakari was just beginning to unravel, and whatever lay ahead, Blake would face it head-on. Blake's heart pounded in his chest as the darkness of space stretched out before him. The aftermath of their strike on the Vakari flagship was hanging in the air like an unspoken promise. The explosion had been massive, an explosion that had lit up the stars and sent shockwaves through both sides of the battlefield. But even as the massive fiery debris drifted away, Blake knew the war was far from over. The Vakari weren't finished. They never were. His fighter hovered in the void, the control stick trembling in his hands as the silence of space enveloped him. The comms were dead, and Blake couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the air, something deeper than the battle, something more than just the war itself. As his ship turned back toward Earth's forces, he realized just how fragile their situation had become. The Vakari weren't just fighting to conquer, they were fighting to reshape the galaxy, and humanity had found itself at the center of that storm. The stars outside seemed to pulse, alive with the distant hum of unknown power. Blake glanced over at Mara's fighter, the only other ship left in their squadron. She had been with him through it all, her loyalty unwavering even as the world crumbled around them. But now she was silent, lost in her own thoughts. Blake knew what was going through her mind. He could see the doubt in her eyes when their mission failed. They had given everything to stop the Vakari, but the truth was staring them in the face. Earth's defenses were crumbling, and every victory they had tasted felt more like a fleeting moment of hope than a lasting triumph. Blake's mind raced. The words of the Vakari leader echoed in his thoughts, each one more haunting than the last. "We are protectors, guardians of something far greater than you can imagine," the voice had said. Was it true? Was this war truly about something more than power and conquest? The Vakari had acted with such precision, such authority. It was almost as though they were playing a game that humanity couldn't yet comprehend. And now Blake realized with a sinking feeling, the galaxy itself was the battlefield, and humanity had unwittingly become a player in a game they weren't ready for. The silence was broken as a new wave of Vakari ships appeared in the distance, cutting through space like a storm. Blake's eyes narrowed as he checked his readouts. This wasn't just a standard attack. The Vakari were gathering, pulling their forces together as if preparing for something bigger than anything they had faced before. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and Blake could feel the weight of every moment that passed. "This isn't over," Blake muttered to himself as he gripped the controls tighter. Not by a long shot, the comms came to life with Mara's voice. "Blake, do you see this? They're consolidating their forces. It's like they're preparing for something." Blake nodded, though he knew she couldn't see him. "I know. It's like they've been waiting for us to hit them, waiting for us to make this move." He turned his fighter, directing it toward Earth's fleet, but the sight before him was unsettling. The Vakari ships weren't just moving in military formation. They were shifting, flowing together in ways that were almost natural. It was as if the ships were alive, reacting to the environment, responding to the movements of their fleet as one. Blake's heart raced, the blood in his veins turning cold. They weren't just invaders anymore. The Vakari had become something else entirely, something beyond what he had ever imagined. "We need to find out what they're really after," Mara said, her voice tense with urgency. "We can't just keep fighting blindly. There's something here, something we don't understand." Blake's mind flashed back to the moment before their strike on the flagship. The alien leader's voice, calm and detached, had hinted at something more. They had called humanity chosen. They had spoken of protecting the future. Blake's eyes darted back to the oncoming Vakari ships. If the Vakari were truly trying to protect something, then what was it? What was at stake that made them willing to go to war with an entire species? His thoughts were interrupted by a voice over the comms. "Captain Blake, we've received a message." It was the voice of one of Earth's communication officers, but there was something different in her tone, something urgent, even fearful. "It's from the Vakari flagship." Blake's pulse quickened. "Put it through," he said, his voice tight with anticipation. A crackle of static filled the air, and then the alien voice, cold and steady, filled the cockpit. "Blake, it's time for you to understand. The war you fight is not your own. You are not the first to challenge us, but you are the last." Blake's heart skipped a beat. There was something in the voice, something ancient, something that sent a shiver down his spine. "The last?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, The voice replied, its calmness sending a chill through Blake's soul. "You are the last species to stand against us, and soon you will understand why." The comms went silent. Blake sat in stunned silence for a moment, the weight of the words sinking in. The last species. Were they saying that humanity was the final barrier? The last hope in a war that spanned across the stars? The Vakari weren't just fighting to conquer Earth. They were fighting to preserve something far older, far more dangerous. And humanity had been dragged into the center of it. "Blake, we need to move." Mara's voice broke through the silence. "They're coming for Earth now." Blake snapped out of his reverie and turned his fighter back toward the battlefield. His mind was racing, but his resolve was clear. The war wasn't just about humanity's survival anymore. It was about protecting something far greater, something that he couldn't even begin to understand. But whatever it was, humanity would face it head-on. The Vakari were closing in fast. Blake's fighter accelerated, weaving through the chaos of the battlefield, his heart beating with the rhythm of the war around him. The future of humanity, the future of the galaxy itself, was on the line, and Blake knew one thing for certain. No matter what the Vakari were hiding, no matter what was at stake, humanity would not go down without a fight. It wasn't over. Not yet. Not while Blake still drew breath. The final push was unlike anything Blake had ever experienced. His ship cut through the blackness of space, the hum of the engines filling his ears, his heart racing in time with every beat. The Vakari fleet, now fully mobilized, had formed a defensive perimeter around Earth, as if they had anticipated the final battle. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut through. Blake could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a sense of inevitability that weighed on him like a collapsing star. But he couldn't afford to stop, not now, not when everything was on the line. Earth's forces had assembled in what could only be described as a desperate stand, a last-ditch effort to protect the planet. Their ships were scattered, battered from the continuous onslaught, but still holding strong, refusing to yield. The Vakari, though, were relentless. Their ships moved as one, a perfectly coordinated swarm that seemed to anticipate humanity's every move. Blake could feel the weight of the galaxy itself pressing in on him. This wasn't just about Earth anymore. This was the endgame, the final test for humanity's place in the universe. "Blake," Mara's voice came through the comms, urgent but steady. "We need to break their formation. If we don't, they'll destroy us. We're running out of time." Blake didn't answer immediately. His eyes locked onto the Vakari flagship in the distance, its dark form towering over the battlefield like an ominous shadow. Everything he had fought for, everything humanity had suffered, had led them to this moment. The flagship was the heart of the Vakari forces, the key to their strategy. If they could take it down, there was a chance, just a chance, that they could end this war. But it was more than that. This was humanity's proving ground. This was their moment to show the galaxy that they weren't just survivors. They were fighters, and they would not bow. Blake's hands gripped the controls of his fighter, every muscle in his body tensed with anticipation. He wasn't just fighting for Earth anymore. He was fighting for everything that humanity represented. The ability to endure, to rise against overwhelming odds, to never give up. They had lost so much already. They couldn't lose now. The fighters around him were ready. Earth's forces had regrouped, and the final assault was about to begin. Blake pushed the throttle forward, and his ship surged ahead, the cold expanse of space rushing past him. He could see Mara's ship, in the distance, flying in perfect formation with him, their sync as flawless as it had been throughout the war. Despite the overwhelming odds, there was something deeply comforting about having her by his side. She had fought beside him from the very start, and her presence gave him strength. As they neared the Vakari flagship, Blake's eyes narrowed. The flagship was massive, its surface etched with strange markings that seemed to shift as if alive. There was something alien, something otherworldly about it, and Blake knew, deep down, that they weren't just fighting for Earth anymore. They were fighting for the future of the galaxy itself. Whatever the Vakari were protecting, whatever they had been guarding for millennia, humanity was now at the center of that battle. Blake's fighter shook as incoming fire rained down from the Vakari ships, but he didn't flinch. He was past the point of fear now. They had come this far, and he wouldn't back down. With a sharp turn, he avoided the blasts, his fighter weaving through the chaos, moving toward the heart of the Vakari fleet. The flagship loomed ahead, its massive form blocking out the stars, and Blake's mind cleared as he focused entirely on his target. Mara's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Blake, now's our chance, take the shot." Blake nodded, though he knew she couldn't see him. He was ready. The moment had arrived. The ship's targeting system locked onto the flagship, and for a brief moment, time seemed to slow. Blake's finger hovered over the trigger, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. One shot, one moment to end this war. He fired. The explosion was blinding, a burst of light that sent shockwaves through the battlefield. Blake felt his fighter rock with the impact, the force of the explosion sending ripples through the space around him. For a moment, everything went still. The Vakari flagship had been struck, but the war wasn't over. Far from it. The Vakari fleet shifted, adapting to the new threat with an unnerving speed. They weren't backing down. They were evolving, growing more relentless with each passing second. Blake's heart pounded in his chest. He watched as the Vakari ships reorganized, their movements now even more synchronized, more precise. It was as if they had anticipated this moment, as if they had always known this was how the war would unfold. They weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for something much more ancient, something far greater than Blake had ever imagined. "This isn't over," Mara said, her voice filled with the same realization. "We've struck the flagship, but they're not going to let us win that easily." Blake's eyes darted around the battlefield. Earth's forces were still fighting, still pushing back, but the Vakari were adapting too quickly. The situation was growing more dire with each passing moment. But Blake wouldn't give up. Not now. Not when they had come so far. There had to be a way to break the Vakari's hold. As the battle raged on, Blake's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of everything they had learned. The Vakari were guardians, protectors of something much greater than the galaxy. They weren't just invaders, they were trying to keep something hidden, something buried deep within the stars. And humanity, for better or worse, had become the key to unlocking it. Blake didn't know what it was. He didn't know what the Vakari were trying to protect, but he knew this. Humanity had proven its worth. They had proven that they weren't just another species to be wiped out. They were a force to be reckoned with. And no matter what the Vakari were hiding, humanity would face it. Together. As the battle continued to rage, Blake made a silent promise to himself and to everyone who had fought beside him. He would see this through. They would find a way to win. And whatever the galaxy held in store, humanity would be ready. The war wasn't over. Not by a long shot.